The purpose of this video is to review over the various blood vessels of the human body. Now on this model that we are looking at, you will notice that the arteries will be red and the veins will be blue. As we begin, we'll begin with the heart. And just as a reminder, the heart is four-chambered, where we have our right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. The blood vessels entering and leaving the heart consist of the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, the aortic arch, and the pulmonary trunk. With regards to the aorta, it has three branches that come off of it. The first branch is our brachiocephalic artery. The second branch will be our left common carotid artery, and then our left subclavian artery. The left subclavian artery will change to the axillary in the armpit area, and then once it leaves the armpit area, it will change to the brachial. Returning back, our common carotid will continue, and then we'll notice a branch. Now, with regards to the blood vessel, anytime we have a change in location or we have a branching, we have a new name. The branch that goes across the top would be our external carotid, and the one that would go deep and into the brain would be our internal carotid. Our brachiocephalic artery branches, and here we would have our right common carotid and our right subclavian. Again, once we reach the armpit area, then we would see the axillary. Returning to our superior vena cava, the first branch off the superior vena cava, which is just right here, and all of this here, would be our right and left brachiocephalic veins. With our brachiocephalic veins, we have a branch right here, and we have a branch right here, and those become the right and left jugular, common jugular. You'll notice that the jugular branches, so we would have our external jugular and our internal jugular veins. This second branch, which is here and here, become our subclavian veins, and again they move and become the axillary once they're in the armpit area. If we look, this being the diaphragm across here, and we look at our inferior vena cava, we'll notice that we have the liver, so we have hepatic arteries and veins. We have the spleen, so right here, the spleen being the splenic arteries and veins. And then we have the kidney, so we would have our renal arteries and veins. Just a quick reminder, as you're studying for the lab practical, do include artery and vein, left or right, as needed for each of the labeling. Also, remember that arteries are red, veins are blue, except in pulmonary, the reverse is true. If you have a model, and that model in this area right here has a purple blood vessel, then you would be seeing the hepatic portal. This does not show it, but we do have models where we have a purple blood vessel, and that would be the hepatic portal. Also, sometimes this right here, this being the artery, and this would typically be, instead of the pulmonary trunk, instead of being blue, we would see this as purple. Again, that's showing the level of oxygen, and so arteries red, veins blue, except in pulmonary, the reverse is true. Pulmonary being our lungs, and so when looking in the lungs, the blue represent the pulmonary arteries, and the red represent the pulmonary veins. Again, let's do a quick review over the blood vessels thus far. So we have the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava. We have the aortic arch with the brachiocephalic artery, our left common carotid artery, our left subclavian artery. The left subclavian changes to the axillary in the armpit area, and then the brachial once it's in the forearm. Our common carotid will branch and make the external common carotid and the internal common carotid arteries. Our brachiocephalic will branch and it will form the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery, which would then go to axillary and then brachial. Our superior vena cava will branch, forming the right and left brachiocephalic veins. They branch, and we have our right and left common jugular veins. The common jugular branch, so we would have our external jugular and our internal jugular. Going back, the second branch off of the brachiocephalic veins would be the subclavian veins, would go into the axillary. We look at our pulmonary region. This is the pulmonary trunk. It is an artery. That means that all of these blue that we see are pulmonary arteries. All of the red that we see are pulmonary veins. We have the diaphragm located here. We have our inferior vena cava with our lungs, and so we have our hepatic arteries and veins. We have our spleen here with our splenic arteries and veins, and we have our kidneys with our renal arteries and veins. When we have the aorta past the diaphragm, this is now known as the abdominal aorta. Here's a chance for you to stop the video and just quiz yourself thus far on the blood vessels. I would say spend some time in the heart region. Those tend to be the most difficult, and once you get those down, everything else becomes much easier. On this slide, we will review over the blood vessels of the arm and the blood vessels of the pelvic area. Let's begin with the pelvic area. Now we have our inferior vena cava and we have the abdominal aorta. The branching will be the same. The only difference will be artery, vein, left or right. So as we look at this, we'll notice that our abdominal aorta branches. Once we have a branch, we have a new name. So we have our right and left common iliac arteries. It remains right and left common iliac until our next branching. The branch that goes inside would be our right and left internal iliac arteries, and once it continues, it would be the right and left external iliac arteries. So it's common iliac, internal iliac, external iliac. It remains external iliac until it passes through the leg, at which point we'll look at in future slides. The inferior vena cava does the same branching, where we have our right and left common iliac veins, our right and left internal iliac veins, and our right and left external iliac veins. With regards to the arm, remember that in this area we have our subclavian artery, and it remains subclavian artery till we reach the armpit area, at which time it becomes axillary. Once we get to the forearm here, this upper arm, we're going to call this the brachial. It remains the brachial artery until we reach the elbow region. Notice at the elbow we have a branching. This is the thumb side, so this red blood vessel here would be our radial artery, And this right here would be our ulnar artery. Do remember to include right and left in each of the namings. With our vein, we will have our subclavian vein, and then notice that when we get to the armpit area, we have the axillary. It remains axillary until we have this branching. Now this nub that's cut off is a superficial vein, and that is the basalic vein. And then we have our brachial, and it remains brachial until we have a branching again at the elbow region. The one that's on the thumb side will be our radial vein. Then we have our ulnar vein, and this third branch right here is the cephalic vein. So again, we have the subclavian, and then it becomes axillary, and then we have a branching where we have our basalic and our brachial, which moves to the radial and ulnar, and then this outer one is the cephalic vein. On this slide, we will continue by looking at the pelvic and then the leg regions. So we had our abdominal aorta, our common iliac arteries, internal iliac artery, external iliac artery. It passes the pelvic bone and then becomes the femoral artery. Same thing with our inferior vena cava, common iliac veins, internal iliac veins, external iliac veins. We pass the pelvic region. Now this long blood vessel that continues down is the greater saphenous vein, and this that's cut here but continues down and goes back behind the femur and back behind the leg, this is the femoral vein. And continuing on this slide, we can see we have passed the pelvic area. This blood vessel continuing down is the greater saphenous vein. This blood vessel that has been cut here, but is a continuation here and moving down behind the femur, is the femoral vein. We have passed the pelvic area, so we have become the femoral artery. Once we get to the back of the knee, it is called the popliteal artery. We have a branching. We will have our anterior tibial artery and our posterior tibial artery. Just to review one more time, we have the greater saphenous vein. We have our femoral vein. If it continued down to the knee area, it would become the popliteal vein. We have our femoral artery continuing back of the knee, it's the popliteal. Branching, we have the anterior tibial artery and the posterior tibial artery.